Rat Girl is a creepy story for kids that comes from the Czech Republic. It's about a young girl who finds it hard to fit in at her new school. There was a young girl named Radka who lived in a small city in the Czech Republic. Her father lost his job and was unable to find work. The family fell on hard times and were forced to sell their house. They had to move to Prague and rent an apartment in an old, decrepit building. Radka was sad to say goodbye to all her friends in school and promised them she would try to keep in contact with them. The young girl didn't like the hustle and bustle of the new city in which she was forced to live. The people seemed to be very unfriendly, and there were no kids her age living in the apartment building. As summer came to an end, she began to dread what life had in store for her. To allay her fears, her parents told her that everything would be fine once she started school. The young girl wasn't so sure. On her first day of school, Radka hoped that she would make some new friends. However, she found that her new classmates were very unpleasant. When she tried to talk with them, they just turned up their noses at her and walked away. When she tried to join in with their games, they refused to include her. As the days went on, the kids at school began to display an intense hatred for the poor girl. They taunted her relentlessly, making fun of her hair, her clothes, and her accent. They told her that her face looked like a rat and christened her Rat Girl. She tried to tell her parents that she was being bullied in school, but they were too busy worrying about the family's finances to pay much attention. The bullying gradually got worse and worse, and Radka had no idea what to do about it. Some of the kids would punch her and kick her and call her names. Others would beat her up and steal her lunch. Still more would play cruel tricks on her, tearing up her school books or writing on her locker. She spent most of her days at school desperately trying to avoid her classmates. The bullying gradually got worse and worse, and Radka had no idea what to do about it. Some of the kids would punch her and kick her and call her names. Others would beat her up and steal her lunch. Still more would play cruel tricks on her, tearing up her school books or writing on her locker. She spent most of her days at school desperately trying to avoid her classmates. On the way home from school that evening, she found a dead rat by the side of the road. She picked it up and brought it home with her. When her parents went out after dinner, Radka took a meat grinder out of the kitchen cupboard and put the rat inside. She turned the handle and ground the dead rat up into minced meat. Then, she cooked it in a frying pan. It smelled awful, so she added lots of herbs and spices. When her disgusting meal was finished, she placed it neatly in a plastic container and put it in her school bag. The next day, at school, Radka waited until lunchtime to unveil her horrible plan. When the bell rang for lunch, she made her way to the school cafeteria and sat at one table, on her own. She took the fried rat meat out of her bag, placed it on the table in front of her, and waited. Soon enough, two girls came over and started teasing her and calling her names. They stole her lunch and passed it around the cafeteria. Everyone had a bite. All of her classmates were laughing at her and calling her a rat girl. About 1 hour later, her schoolmates began feeling queasy. One by one, the kids got up from their desks and ran to the toilet. The teacher had no idea what was going on. Radka ran out to the school toilets to see the results of her handiwork. All of the stalls in the bathroom were occupied, and she could hear the sounds of retching, vomiting, and diarrhea. The air was filled with the smell of poop and puke. Some girls were holding their hands over their mouths, waiting desperately for a cubicle. Others couldn't wait and had resorted to pooping in the sinks. When there were no sinks free, one girl ran in and puked all over a girl who was pooping in the sink. It was utter pandemonium. Radka smiled with satisfaction. By the next morning, her classmates had figured out her cunning plan. During class, she could see all of the girls staring at her and giving her dirty looks. She knew that it was just a matter of time before they took their revenge on her. During lunch break, two girls approached Radka. She was expecting them to beat her up, but instead, they apologized to her.
"We're all really sorry about the way we treated you, Radka,"
they said.
We hope we can make it up to you.
The girls told her that her classmates were waiting for her in the classroom. They said they all wanted to apologize and welcome her into their group. Although Radka was suspicious, she was so eager for acceptance that she threw caution to the wind and followed them. They led her down the corridors, but, as they were passing the door to the school basement, the two girls suddenly turned and grabbed her. One of them held her tightly while the other opened the door. Radka tried to struggle, but it was no use. The girls pushed her through the doorway. Radka tumbled down the stairs and landed on the cold concrete below. She heard the sound of the door slamming and the key turning in the lock. The basement was in a disused part of the school. No matter how loud she screamed, nobody would ever hear her. Lying on the floor of the basement, her back aching, Radka began to cry bitterly. She started looking for another way out, but the windows were too high to reach. She was trapped like a rat in a cage. In frustration, the poor girl began kicking the wall. She kicked it so hard that her foot went straight through the plaster. She got down on her knees and began tearing at the wall, making the hole bigger and bigger until it was large enough for her to fit through. Sticking her head through the hole and peering inside, Radka saw that there were no water pipes or electrical wires behind the wall. For some reason, there was a small gap between the inner wall and the outer wall. It was a very narrow passageway that led to the left and right, but it was just about wide enough for her to squeeze through. Radka felt that it was her only avenue of escape, so she crawled through the hole and made her way down the narrow passage. It was dark and she was scared, but she forced herself to press on. Eventually, she noticed a thin beam of light shining through a tiny hole in the wall. She scratched at it with her fingernail, and it got a little bigger. Peeking through, she realized that she was right beside the school principal's office. She could see the principal sitting at his desk, unaware he was being watched. He wasn't doing any work, he was just sitting there, staring into space. Then, he began picking his nose and eating it.
Ew. Gross.
Thought Radka as she chuckled to herself and moved on. She crawled further down the passage and came to another bright spot in the wall. She scratched at it to make the hole bigger and put her eye up to it. She discovered that it was the teacher's lounge. She could see her geography teacher and her history teacher. They were locked in a passionate embrace and were kissing each other.
Wow. They're having an affair.
She thought to herself. Moving on, Radka found that the passage began to slope upwards. In some places it was almost vertical, and she struggled to find a foothold. Eventually, she reached another tiny point of light. She looked through the little hole, and it took a while for her eyes to adjust to the light. When they did, she realized that she was staring directly into the teacher's bathroom. She could see her English teacher sitting on the toilet. Suddenly, she heard a loud splash.
Disgusting.
However, when she tried to go backwards, she found that she couldn't budge an inch. Her butt had become stuck fast between the densely packed concrete blocks. In desperation, she even tried to rotate her body like a drill, but her efforts were in vain. Her worst fears had come true.
I can't believe it.
Said Radka.
I'm jammed.
She began to panic and felt as if she couldn't breathe. She wondered if she would be trapped behind the walls forever. The young girl rested for a few minutes, telling herself to remain calm and try to gather her thoughts. She began thinking about her mother and father and the fact that she might not ever see them again. Her eyes welled up with tears.
Help! Someone help!
She screamed again and again, but nobody answered her cries. Just then, Radka felt something brush against her leg. There was a strange, musty smell in the air. She put her hand down and felt the touch of soft, warm fur. When her fingers closed around the long, fleshy tail, she screamed.
Rats!
All at once, at least 3 or 4 rats began swarming on Radka. They climbed up her legs and scrambled over her head, their sharp claws digging into her skin. She began to panic, and she felt something bite into her ear. Radka started slapping at the scurrying rats with her hands, desperately trying to make them retreat. One rat began nibbling at her toes and she kicked it away. Her frightened screams rang out along the passageway, but nobody was there to hear them. She lay there for what seemed like hours, stuck in the passageway, fending off a group of ravenous rodents. Every time she thought the rats had gone, they reappeared and attacked her again. Her head was pounding and her body ached. All hope of salvation was gone. Going crazy with the pain, Radka reached out and grabbed hold of one of the rats. In a rage, she strangled it with one hand and put the rat's dead body under head to use as a pillow. The other rats scurried back to their hiding places. They seemed scared. Radka lingered in the hole for 3 days, halfway between life and death. Sometimes she managed to get a few minutes of sleep. Whenever the rats came too close, she would kill one of them with her bare hands and toss the carcass at its comrades. She had to go to the toilet and was forced to do her business right there on the spot. Lying in her own poop and pee, Radka gave up all hope.
Oh, please just hurry up and let me die.
She thought miserably. A horrible smell permeated the narrow passage. Radka was extremely hungry and dying of thirst. All she wanted was something to drink. One rat strayed too close to her, and when she got it in her clutches, she brought it up to her mouth and bit into its neck. She began to drink the rat's blood. But the blood of one rat was not enough. She needed more. After a month, Radka was still stuck behind the walls. She managed to survive by catching rats, drinking their blood and eating their dead bodies. She was terribly bored and her only entertainment was to listen to the rats squeaking. It got to the point when she almost felt she could understand what they were saying to each other. One day, when Radka awoke, she tried to squeeze herself around the corner again. She had become so thin that she managed to dislodge herself and got unstuck. She crawled further down the passageway until she came to a welcome spot of light. She punched a hole in the wall and a bright light shone through, burning her eyes. She dragged herself through the hole and, like a snake, slithered into the room. Radka's teacher was standing at the front of the classroom, and her classmates were sitting at their desks. All of a sudden, they heard a pounding noise and the wall at the back of the classroom burst open. Bricks and plaster were scattered on the floor. As they watched open-mouthed, a pair of fists emerged from the hole and something dirty and smelly emerged from the depths. The stench reeked like 100 toilets. The thing scurried across the floor and they realized that it was a young girl, her face covered in dried blood and her clothes soaked in poop and pee. Everyone began to scream in terror. Just then, an army of rats came streaming out of the hole and attacked the other children.
Kill them all,
Screamed Radka as she pounced on one girl and grabbed hold of her arm. Insane with hunger, she sank her teeth into the girl's hand and drank her blood. The girl screamed in horror and pain. The teacher rushed over and tried to rescue the girl. Radka pounced on the teacher too and began gnawing on her legs. The children were screaming and crying as the rats swarmed all over them. The vicious rodents scurried back and forth, scratching, biting and feeding on their terrified victims. Nobody was spared. Their sharp teeth chomped down on whatever they found, hands, legs and necks. It was utter pandemonium. Minutes later, when the police arrived, it was all over. They found the classroom's walls, floor and ceiling covered in blood. The skeletal remains of the children lay scattered around the room. In the middle of all this chaos, there was a young girl sitting on the floor, gnawing on the teacher's corpse.